Have you ever wondered what makes a true warrior? Is it strength, resilience, the refusal to back down even when the world turns its back on you? Tonight, on Veil Marks, we bring you a story unlike any other. A story of a dog who was thrown away, beaten, and left to die, but refused to be broken. This is the story of Buster, the Pitbull who defied all odds. Pitbulls are one of the most misunderstood breeds in the world. Despite their reputation, they are among the most loyal, loving, and protective dogs. But what happens when society sees them as a threat rather than a friend? Before we begin, if you find meaning in stories like these, please hit the like button, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more powerful and emotional stories to life. And trust me, you won't want to miss the incredible lesson at the end of this one. So now, let me ask you, what would you do if everything you loved was taken from you? Would you give up, or would you fight? Let's find out. The rain fell in a soft, steady rhythm, tapping against the polished stone of the freshly dug grave. The sky hung low and heavy, a blanket of gray pressing down on the quiet cemetery. A chill lingered in the damp air, wrapping around the old man who stood motionless, his frail hands resting gently on the cold tombstone. Henry Mitchell had seen many things in his lifetime: war, loss, the slow passage of time that took everything away, piece by piece, but nothing, not the years spent on the battlefield, not the aching loneliness that had settled in his chest long ago, had prepared him for this. Before him, etched into the smooth stone, were the words that carried the weight of a life that should have never been forgotten. Buster, a companion, a survivor, a legend, a dog. That was all some people would see, just another stray, another name in the wind. But Henry knew better. Buster wasn't just a dog, he was a warrior, a fighter who had clawed his way back from the depths of despair, a soul that had been cast aside and left to fend for itself, yet somehow, against all odds, had found a way to live, to love, and to change the world. Henry let out a slow breath, the weight of memory pressing down on his chest. His fingers brushed against the rusted metal of the old dog wheelchair at his feet, its wheels worn from years of use, the leather straps cracked from time and age. It had once carried a broken dog across fields, through town streets, down the very roads that had once rejected him. Now it stood as a reminder that even the most shattered souls could find a way to run again. The rain dripped from the brim of Henry's old hat, rolling down his deeply lined face, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were far away, pulled into the past by the whisper of the wind through the cemetery trees. He could still hear the way Buster's paws had once patted across the wooden floors of his home, the way his tail had thumped against the furniture, an unspoken rhythm of trust and love. He could still see those deep, knowing eyes filled with a quiet understanding that needed no words. But now the house was silent. No clicking of nails on the floorboards, no gentle huff of breath as Buster curled beside him by the fire. Only the echo of memories remained. A lump formed in Henry's throat, the kind that comes from holding back too much grief for too long. "Did you ever think we'd come this far, old boy?" he murmured, his voice thick and low. "That you'd be more than just another forgotten stray?" The wind answered with a slow, hollow sigh, rustling the nearby trees, as if the world itself paused to listen. Henry's grip tightened on his cane as he took a step closer, his gaze never leaving the stone. He could still remember the day he'd found Buster, how the dog had barely been clinging to life, discarded like garbage. A creature so broken that it seemed impossible he'd ever trust again, let alone fight his way back to the world. But Buster had done more than just survive. He had defied the odds. The town that had once turned its back on him had come to love him. People who had once crossed the street to avoid a pit bull with scars had come to see him as a hero. And Henry, An old soldier who had long since stopped believing in miracles had found hope again in the presence of a dog who refused to give up. The rain grew heavier, but Henry didn't move. He simply stood there, his thoughts drifting back further and further until time itself seemed to unravel. How does a dog, abandoned, beaten, left to die, become a legend? How does a life once considered worthless leave behind a legacy that would be remembered long after he was gone? There was only one way to answer that, by going back to the very beginning, to the moment when Buster had been cast into the dark, to the night he should have died, but didn't. Henry exhaled, his breath a wisp of mist in the cold air. His eyes, heavy with age and sorrow, lingered on the name carved in stone one last time before he whispered, "Let's go back, old boy. Let's tell them how it really began." And as the rain fell harder, washing away the footprints in the damp earth, the story of Buster unfolded once more, not just a tale of survival, but a testament to the strength that lay in those who refused to be forgotten. Because some lives, no matter how broken, deserved to be remembered. The night was cold, the kind of cold that sank into your bones and stayed there. A biting wind howled through the empty streets, rattling old road signs and carrying with it the scent of rain and decay. The sky stretched overhead like an endless void, moonlight barely piercing through thick, swirling clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a lone car engine echoed off the silent landscape, its low growl swallowed by the darkness. Then headlights cut through the mist, bouncing off the icy ground as an old pickup truck rumbled to a stop by the riverbank. The truck's rusted frame groaned as it settled into place, its exhaust curling into the cold night air. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the quiet hum of the idling engine, the rhythmic tapping of raindrops against metal. Then, the driver's side door creaked open. A man stepped out, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. He pulled his coat tighter around his frame, the collar shielding his face from the sharp wind. With quick, methodical movements, he made his way to the back of the truck, where a large burlap sack lay motionless against the bed. It shifted. A muffled whimper came from inside. The man hesitated for just a moment, then shook his head, as if shaking off the last shred of guilt trying to claw its way in. He reached down, grabbing the sack by its knotted top. With one swift motion, he hoisted it up, the weight inside making his arms strain slightly. The sack writhed as the thing inside struggled, but the man didn't falter. He stepped toward the riverbank, stopping just short of the ledge, where the land crumbled into dark, rushing water. No hesitation, no second thoughts. With a grunt, he swung the sack outward and let go. For a split second, there was only silence. Then, the sound of fabric hitting water, followed by a sickening splash. The burlap sack sank immediately, pulled under by the river's ruthless current. Ripples expanded across the surface, the only sign that something, or someone, had been there at all. The man stood still, watching as the river carried away what he had left behind. Then, without a word, he turned back, climbed into his truck, and drove off, his taillights vanishing into the darkness. Beneath the surface, panic erupted. Inside the sack, Buster fought for his life. The moment the icy water swallowed him whole, it stole the breath from his lungs, sending a sharp shock through his body. He thrashed wildly, but the rough fabric around him was tight, restricting his movement. The water was relentless, surging into his nose and mouth, filling his ears with an eerie, muted roar. His lungs burned, his heartbeat pounded in his chest like a drum of war. Every instinct in his body screamed to break free, but the sack was strong, the ropes tied mercilessly around it holding firm. He clawed at the fabric with desperate, shaking paws, his nails scraping uselessly against the rough weave. His body twisted and jerked, but every movement only tangled him further, pulling him deeper into the abyss. Muddy water seeped into the sack, making it heavier, dragging it down faster. Buster's mind raced, a storm of fear and confusion. How had it come to this? Once he had been strong, a fighter. He had been trained to win, forced into a life where every battle was a fight for survival. He had never asked for it, never wanted the blood, the pain, the roar of a crowd cheering for his suffering. But it was the only life he had known, and now, discarded like trash, he was drowning alone in the dark. His body screamed for air, muscles aching, lungs burning. His instincts took over, blocking out the fear, pushing away the exhaustion. He bit down, teeth sinking into the fabric, and shook his head violently. The burlap tore, just slightly, but it was enough to let a sliver of water rush in, washing over his face. He kept biting, kept clawing, his paws tearing through the fabric as he twisted and fought. The weight of the river pressed down on him, relentless, unforgiving. But Buster was a warrior, and warriors didn't stop fighting, not until their last breath. With one final desperate motion, he broke through. His head burst above the surface, and he gasped, sucking in air so sharply it burned his throat. Rain pelted his face, his soaked fur clinging to his body, making him heavier, slower. But he didn't stop. He kicked hard, pushing against the current, his legs weak but determined. Every stroke forward was agony, but he kept going. He had no idea where he was headed, only that he couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. The river fought back, threatening to pull him under again, but Buster didn't yield. He paddled with all the strength he had left, inching toward the distant shore. The sound of rushing water roared in his ears, but through the chaos he focused on one thing, the feeling of solid ground beneath his paws. It felt like an eternity, but finally his body collided with the muddy riverbank. His claws dug into the wet earth, dragging himself forward inch by inch until he collapsed onto solid land. For a long time he didn't move. He just lay there, chest heaving, muscles trembling, the taste of dirt and blood in his mouth. Rain poured down on him, soaking him to the bone, but he barely felt it. His body was too exhausted, too beaten, too broken, and yet he was alive. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head. The world around him was cold, unforgiving. The city lights in the distance flickered like ghosts, distant and unreachable. No one had seen him. No one had cared. The man who had thrown him away was gone, and so was the life he had once known. Buster closed his eyes, his breath unsteady. For the first time, he was truly alone. But as the storm raged on, as the river carried away the last traces of the burlap sack that was meant to be his grave, something stirred inside him. A whisper of something ancient. A fire that had never truly gone out. He had survived the pit. He had survived the river. And somehow, he would survive this too. He was Buster, and his story wasn't over yet. The night was bitter, the kind that seeped into your bones and made the world feel empty. Snow blanketed the ground in thick layers of white, muting the distant hum of the city. The wind whispered through the barren trees, rattling the street signs and sending a shiver through the old man as he walked slowly down the desolate road. Henry Mitchell pulled his coat tighter around his frame, his breath curling in the frigid air like a ghost of something long forgotten. His gait was uneven, his cane pressing into the slush-covered pavement with every slow, deliberate step. His body had never fully recovered from the war, but the pain in his leg wasn't what weighed on him most. It was the silence. It had followed him home from the battlefield, settled into the walls of his house, crawled into his bed at night, and wrapped itself around his chest. It had taken the faces of the men he'd lost and played them like an old film reel behind his closed eyes. It had made him wary of attachments, cautious of letting anyone or anything too close. Because everything you loved eventually was taken away. He had made peace with that, or at least, that's what he told himself. Henry was halfway down the block when he saw it. A shape, barely distinguishable against the cold glow of the street lamp, curled up near the edge of the sidewalk. At first, he thought it was just a pile of discarded rags, another forgotten thing left to the mercy of the winter. But then it moved. Just the slightest twitch, a subtle shift in the way the shadows stretched across the snow. A dog. He slowed his steps, his sharp, weathered eyes narrowing as he took in the sight before him. The creature was nothing more than skin and bone, its ribs pressing against its dull, matted fur. Scars traced over its body, some fresh, some old, whispering stories of violence and suffering. But it was the eyes that caught Henry's attention, the same way a sniper's scope caught a glint of light, empty, hollow, hopeless. Henry had seen that look before, in the mirror, in the eyes of the men who made it home but never really left the war behind. He knew what it meant. It meant the dog had already given up. A heavy sigh escaped him, the kind that carried years of exhaustion. He wasn't the kind of man to stop for strays. Not anymore. There had been a time, maybe, when he would have bent down, whistled softly, tried to coax the creature into trusting him. But that was before life had taught him that caring for something, anything, only ever led to heartache. So he kept walking. His cane clicked against the pavement, his boots crunching through the snow. He didn't look back. But then, just as he was about to pass, he heard it. A sound so soft, so fragile, that it barely carried over the wind. A whimper. He froze. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't loud or pleading. It was quiet, resigned, like a whisper meant for no one, the last breath of a soldier who knew the battle was already lost. Henry clenched his jaw, something twisting deep in his chest. He had heard that sound before, too. In hospital tents, as men lay bleeding out on cold metal cots. On the battlefield, when the ones who weren't going to make it knew the fight was over. Henry turned his head. The dog hadn't moved. It still lay curled against the base of the street lamp, half buried in the snow, its frail body trembling from the cold. But its eyes were open now, watching him with something he couldn't quite place. Not hope. No, the dog had lost that a long time ago. It was more like recognition, like two ghosts acknowledging each other. Henry inhaled deeply, forcing himself to look away. He didn't need this. He didn't need another reminder of things he couldn't fix. His leg ached, his hands were stiff from the cold, and his house, quiet and lonely as it was waiting for him. He took another step forward, then another, then he stopped. For a long moment he just stood there, staring at the dark stretch of road ahead. His fingers tightened around the worn handle of his cane, the leather smooth from years of use. He swallowed hard. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he turned back. The dog watched him approach, but it didn't move. It didn't flinch, didn't cower, didn't try to drag itself away as so many strays did when a human got too close. It just stared, waiting, like it had already accepted whatever came next. Henry lowered himself slowly, his knee protesting as he crouched down in front of the broken creature. "You don't even care, do you?" His voice was rough, quiet. He wasn't sure if he was talking to the dog or himself. The dog blinked. Henry hesitated, then, without thinking, reached out. The dog tensed slightly, just for a second, as if expecting pain. But Henry didn't hit. He didn't shove it away. He just let his fingers hover there, close enough to touch, but not forcing it. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he murmured. Another breathless second passed. Then, cautiously, the dog lifted its head, just barely, before pressing its cold, scarred nose against the palm of Henry's outstretched hand. Something inside him cracked. Henry swallowed, his throat tight, his chest aching with something he hadn't felt in years. He should have walked away. He should have left well enough alone. But as he looked into those tired, battle-worn eyes, he knew. Neither of them wanted to be alone anymore. With a grunt, he stood, shaking the numbness from his fingers. He turned toward his house, then looked back down at the dog. "Well, you coming or not?" For the first time in what felt like forever, the dog moved. It didn't rush. It didn't wag its tail or bound toward him like a pet eager for affection. It simply pushed itself to its feet, slow, unsteady, before taking a single tentative step forward. Then another. Then another. Henry watched in silence as the dog followed him, its weak legs trembling with each movement, its breath puffing white in the cold. It didn't walk beside him. Not yet. But it followed. And somehow, that was enough. As they moved through the empty streets, the snow fell heavier, coating the world in quiet. For the first time in years, Henry Mitchell didn't mind the silence. The fire crackled softly in the small house, casting a warm golden glow against the walls. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the old wooden windows. But inside, the space remained quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as Henry Mitchell shifted in his chair. The old man sat with his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames, lost in thought. Behind him, in the farthest corner of the room, Buster lay curled up, his frail body pressed against the wooden floor, his ribs rising and falling with each shallow breath. The warmth of the fire reached him, but he didn't move closer. His instincts told him not to. The first few days in Henry's home had been quiet, almost eerily so. Buster had made no attempt to explore, no curiosity about the place. He simply existed, keeping to the shadows like a ghost unsure if it was truly welcome. He was exhausted but never allowed himself to sleep deeply. He was hungry but refused to touch the food placed in front of him. Henry had expected this. He had seen that kind of wariness before, in men who had survived battles but never truly left them behind. Trust was not something that came easy to those who had suffered. So Henry didn't push. Every morning he would place a bowl of food by the fireplace before sitting in his usual chair, pretending not to watch as Buster stared at it with hollow eyes. Some nights, Henry would hear the faint sound of movement, the soft scrape of nails against the floor as Buster inched toward the food, his hunger briefly overcoming his fear. By morning, the bowl would be empty, but Buster would be back in his corner, as if nothing had happened. Henry never spoke about it. He simply kept placing the bowl there, kept leaving the door open just enough to let the dog know he had a choice. Days turned into nights, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the kind of silence that came from two strangers occupying the same space. It became something quieter, more comfortable. A silent agreement, a truce between two lost souls who weren't ready to let each other in, but weren't quite ready to let each other go either. One particularly cold night, the past crept back into Henry's dreams. It started the way it always did, with the sound of gunfire splitting through the desert air, the smell of dust and blood, the shouts of men, orders being barked over the radio, then the explosion. A deafening roar that tore through everything, sending Henry flying backward, the impact stealing the breath from his lungs. He woke up with a start. His body jolted upright, his breath ragged, the ghost of that moment still gripping his chest. His hands trembled as he reached for his cane, steadying himself. The room was dark, the fire reduced to faint embers. But he wasn't alone. At first, Henry thought he was imagining it, the warmth near his leg, the soft weight pressing against his knee. But then he saw them. Two deep brown eyes staring up at him, filled not with fear but with understanding. Buster had moved for the first time, not toward food, not to find an escape route, but toward him. He had heard the nightmare. He had felt the fear. And now, without words, without hesitation, he had placed himself beside Henry, a quiet reassurance. Henry let out a shaky breath, his fingers hesitating before settling lightly on Buster's head. The fur beneath his touch was coarse, uneven with scars, but the warmth was real. Buster didn't flinch. He didn't move away. For the first time, Henry let himself believe that maybe neither of them had to be alone anymore. And for the first time, Buster allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had found a place where he could finally rest. The spring air was crisp, filled with the scent of fresh earth and blooming wildflowers. The world was waking up again, shaking off the harshness of winter, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Buster was alive. His paws pounded against the soft grass, his muscles rippling beneath his sleek gray coat as he sprinted across the open field behind Henry's house. The wind rushed past his ears, the sky stretched wide and endless above him. He chased after a butterfly that danced in the air, leaping up, his powerful legs propelling him toward the sun. For a moment he felt weightless, like nothing in the world could ever catch him again. Henry watched from the porch, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He leaned on his cane, sipping his coffee as he took in the sight before him. It had taken months for Buster to get to this point, to trust, to let go of the ghosts of his past and embrace the present. Henry had seen the change in him, the light returning to those once empty eyes, the fear melting into confidence, the way his tail wagged freely now without hesitation. Buster had come back to life. He was more than just a survivor now. He was a fighter, a warrior, something unstoppable. Until that night. The night that everything was stolen from him again. The moon hung high, casting silver light over the quiet town. Henry had gone to bed early, the rhythmic ticking of the old clock lulling him into a peaceful sleep. But Buster, ever the night watchman, lay by the door, ears twitching at every distant sound. He had grown comfortable here, but his instincts, honed from years of surviving in the streets, never truly faded. Then, the footsteps came. At first, they were distant, just another noise in the night, but as they grew closer, the soft crunch of boots against gravel, something in Buster's chest stirred, a warning, a whisper of danger. His head lifted, the scent of cigarette smoke and sweat filled his nose. Then came the voices. That's the one. I told you these damn dogs shouldn't be allowed here. Filthy Pitbull. It's a menace. The words were sharp, hateful. Buster didn't understand them, but he understood the tone. He had heard voices like these before, voices that came with pain, voices that never meant well. A rock struck the wooden porch railing with a sharp crack. Buster growled, his fur bristling as he rose to his feet. His body tensed, every muscle ready, his mind flashing back to alleyways and battles he never asked to fight. He knew how to defend himself. He had done it before. But this wasn't a fight. It was an ambush. The first blow came fast. A heavy steel pipe swung hard and mercilessly, crashing against his side. Buster yelped, stumbling backward, his ribs screaming in pain. He tried to regain his footing, but before he could, another blow struck, this time against his lower back. A white-hot explosion of agony shot through his body. His legs buckled beneath him. Something was wrong. He tried to stand, to move, but nothing happened. His back legs wouldn't respond. Panic surged through him as he willed his body to work, but it was useless. He collapsed. The world spun. Shadows moved around him, voices still muttering, laughing. A boot nudged his side, shoving him, testing him like they wanted to see if he'd fight back. But he couldn't. He was trapped inside his own body. For the first time since that night at the river, fear truly gripped him. A door creaked open. "Buster?" Henry's voice was groggy, confused. Then silence. Then a sharp intake of breath. "Hey!" The men scattered, their laughter fading into the darkness as they ran. Henry's cane clattered to the porch as he rushed toward Buster. "Oh, God, no! No, no, no!" Henry's hands were on him now, gentle but desperate, searching for the damage. Buster tried to lift his head to reassure him, to tell him in some unspoken way that it was okay. But it wasn't okay. Nothing was okay. His body wouldn't listen. He could feel Henry's trembling hands stroking his fur, his voice murmuring words that Buster couldn't quite make out, but he could hear the pain in them, the fear. Henry tried to help him up, but his back legs didn't move, not even a twitch. The next few days were a blur. The vet's office smelled sharp and sterile, filled with voices that didn't make sense. Henry was always there, his hand never leaving Buster's side, his face lined with exhaustion and worry. Then came the verdict. The injury was severe. His spine had taken the brunt of the blow, damaging the nerves beyond repair. Buster would never walk again. The words meant nothing to him, but he understood the weight in Henry's expression, the way his shoulders sagged as he ran a hand over his face. He understood the loss, and when they finally went home, when the house that had once felt like freedom now felt like a cage, Buster understood something else too. This was the end. He stopped eating. Henry tried. He brought him chicken, fresh and warm, placing it in front of him the way he had when Buster first arrived, but Buster just lay there staring at the floor. The fire crackled beside him, but he no longer moved toward its warmth. He barely moved at all. Because what was the point? What was a dog without his legs, without the wind in his face, without the feeling of the earth beneath his paws, without the ability to run? Buster had fought his whole life. He had fought to escape the pit, fought to survive the river, fought to trust again, to find something worth living for. But now he was nothing. And what was the point of fighting if there was no battle left to win? The crisp autumn air carried the scent of dry leaves and damp earth, swirling golden and crimson foliage across the quiet countryside. The sky stretched wide, painted in soft strokes of amber and fading blue as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. The season was changing, just as everything had changed for Buster. But not all changes had to mean the end. On the front porch of the small wooden house, Henry Mitchell was working. His weathered hands, steady despite the years, tightened a bolt, adjusting the straps of the contraption before him. Pieces of wood, metal rods, leather belts, and 2 sturdy wheels lay scattered around him, remnants of what had taken him weeks to build. A dog wheelchair. Henry had spent hours in his workshop sketching, cutting, measuring, working through trial and error, cursing under his breath when something didn't fit, and smiling softly when a piece finally locked into place. He wasn't a man who believed in miracles, but he believed in effort. He believed in fighting for the ones who had no fight left in them. And right now, he believed in Buster. The dog lay curled inside the house. His lifeless hind legs stretched out behind him, his once powerful body now reduced to quiet, unmoving acceptance. He had given up. Henry could see it in the way Buster barely lifted his head when the porch creaked under his steps, in the way he didn't even try to move toward the food anymore, even when Henry sat beside him for hours, waiting. It wasn't just his body that had stopped working. It was his spirit. Henry exhaled, wiping his hands on his jeans before stepping inside. The wheelchair was ready. But was Buster? The old man crouched down beside the broken warrior, his fingers brushing gently through Buster's fur. The dog didn't flinch anymore, not like he had in the beginning, but he didn't lean into the touch either. "All right, boy," Henry murmured, his voice soft but steady. "I know you don't think it matters anymore, but it does. You matter." Buster barely blinked. Henry sighed. "You don't have to believe me yet. I'll believe enough for both of us." With slow, careful hands, he lifted Buster. The dog was lighter than he should have been, the weight of his muscles fading after weeks of stillness. Henry felt the exhaustion in his frame, the resignation in the way Buster didn't even struggle. But Henry wasn't letting go. He carried him outside, setting him gently onto the wooden porch. The wheelchair stood ready, gleaming under the afternoon sun. Buster's ears twitched at the unfamiliar object, but he made no move to react. Henry worked with patience, sliding the harness around Buster's chest, fastening the straps with care. The dog stiffened slightly when the leather tightened, his breathing shallow, his head lowering as though he expected this to be another cruel joke. But then, Henry stepped back, and for the first time in weeks, Buster was upright. The wheels, sturdy and firm, bore the weight his legs no longer could. He didn't quite understand what was happening. His ears flicked backward, his muscles tensed. Henry saw the hesitation in his eyes, the flicker of fear, so he didn't rush it. Instead, he knelt beside him, running a calming hand over Buster's side. "It's all right, boy. You're safe. Just try." Buster didn't move. Henry hesitated, then gently placed his hands on the frame and pushed forward, just an inch. The wheels rolled. Buster's body shifted, light, smooth, as if the earth had suddenly come alive beneath him. His paws, still strong, touched the wooden porch, pressing lightly against the grain. Something changed in his eyes. He felt it. Henry swallowed hard, watching as Buster instinctively took his first step. Then another, then another. The wheels turned beneath him, carrying him forward. It wasn't perfect. His movement was hesitant, unsteady, but he was moving. For the first time since the attack, since that night when everything had been stolen from him, Buster wasn't trapped anymore. Henry felt something tighten in his chest, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Hope. Then just as Buster took another step, he stopped. His head turned, those deep brown eyes locking onto Henry's. For so long those eyes had been hollow, lost. But now they held something else. A spark, a question, and for the first time, belief. Henry's throat burned, but he smiled anyway. "That's my boy," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. Buster moved again, this time not because Henry pushed him, not because he had no choice, but because he wanted to. A gust of wind swept through the trees, sending golden leaves swirling around them. The sun, warm against Henry's face, bathed the porch in light. And in that moment, Buster ran. Not the way he used to, not with the same strength, the same power, but he ran. And that was enough. Henry wiped a hand over his face, letting out a breathy chuckle. "Took you long enough," he muttered, shaking his head. But Buster wasn't listening. He was too busy chasing the wind again. The town had never seen a dog quite like Buster. At first, he had been nothing more than a pitiful figure, a broken dog that no one believed in, a stray with a story too tragic to matter. But fate had other plans. Buster didn't just survive, he thrived, and in doing so, he changed everything. It started with the fire. It was a cold winter evening, the sky a blanket of deep navy, the streets quiet under a fresh layer of snow. Henry had let Buster roam freely now, at least within the safety of their little town. The people had come to know him, to accept him. He wasn't just that crippled Pitbull anymore. He was Buster, the dog who refused to give up. That night he had wandered toward the town's outskirts, his wheels rolling effortlessly over the icy pavement. That's when he smelled it. The sharp, acrid scent of smoke. His ears perked, his body going rigid. He turned his head toward the flickering orange glow illuminating the dark sky. Then he heard it, a child's scream. Buster moved before he even thought. The house was burning. The flames licked hungrily at the wooden walls, swallowing windows, crawling up toward the roof. The smoke curled into the sky, thick and suffocating, carrying with it the terrified cries of a child trapped inside. The crowd gathered, voices overlapping in panicked urgency. Someone had already called the fire department, but it was too late. The flames had spread too fast. Buster didn't hesitate. With a burst of strength, he tore through the crowd, his wheels kicking up snow as he darted toward the burning house. Voices called after him, Henry's voice among them, but he didn't stop. because Buster knew what it meant to be trapped. He knew what it felt like to be abandoned in the dark, waiting for someone to save you, and he wouldn't let it happen again. The heat was unbearable as he forced his way through the broken door, flames crackling on either side. The thick smoke burned his lungs, his eyes watering against the sting, but he pushed forward. The child, a small boy, no older than 5, was curled up beneath a wooden table, coughing violently, his face streaked with soot and tears. Buster reached him. The boy looked up, terrified. But then he saw the dog, his wheels gleaming in the firelight, his brown eyes steady, unwavering. Buster nudged the boy with his nose. "Move! Come with me." The child hesitated, but something about Buster, the way he didn't run, the way he stood his ground despite the danger, made him trust. The boy grabbed onto Buster's harness, his small hands clenching desperately, and Buster pulled. 1 step, 2. The roof creaked. Time was running out. Buster pushed forward with everything he had left, his wheels skidding over debris, muscles burning as he dragged the boy toward the door. And then, just as the ceiling collapsed behind them, they were out. The cold air hit them like a wave, fresh and pure, the snow beneath them a stark contrast to the raging inferno behind them. The town erupted into cheers. A mother sobbed as she clutched her child, holding him so tightly it seemed as though she'd never let go again. Henry was there too, kneeling beside Buster, his hands gripping his fur as if afraid to lose him. "You crazy mutt," he muttered, voice thick with something Buster didn't quite understand. But he understood the way Henry held on to him. He understood the way the town looked at him now. Not with pity, but with awe. Buster had done something no one thought he could. He had become a hero. The story spread faster than wildfire. The next day, Buster's face was in the local newspaper. By the end of the week, national media had picked it up. Disabled Pitbull saves child from fire. The miracle dog on wheels. People wanted to know about the dog who had been thrown away and had come back stronger, and they weren't just inspired. They wanted to help. It was Henry who had the idea first. Sitting on the porch, watching as Buster chased falling leaves in the yard, he murmured, "We could do more, you know." Buster's ears perked at the sound of his voice. Henry smiled, scratching behind his ears. "We could help others like you, dogs who never got a second chance." And so, Wheels of Hope was born. It started small, a shed out back, a few donated materials. But soon the project grew. Volunteers arrived, local businesses pitched in, people from across the country sent donations inspired by Buster's story. Dogs who had been forgotten, dogs who had been cast aside, much like he once was, now had hope. And Buster, he became the heart of it all. He was the proof that a life wasn't over just because it changed. Proof that you could always run again, even if you had to do it differently. Years passed. Buster grew older. His fur, once sleek and gray, had turned soft with streaks of white. His movements were slower, his once powerful frame a little weaker with time. But his spirit, it never faded. One winter evening, as the first snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, Henry found him curled near the fireplace, breathing slow, steady. "Hey, boy," he murmured, crouching beside him. "You tired?" Buster blinked up at him, his brown eyes filled with something deep and quiet. Henry let out a breath, running a gentle hand over his fur. "You did good," he whispered. "Better than good." Buster sighed softly, his body relaxing under Henry's touch. He was warm, he was safe, and most importantly, he was not alone. When he took his last breath, he did so as a legend. The town honored him. A statue was placed in the park right by the children's playground. A bronze figure of a pit bull on wheels standing proud, his head lifted toward the sky. Beneath it, an inscription. Buster, a fighter, a friend, a legend. He never stopped running. And if you visit that park on any given afternoon, you'll see dogs playing beneath his watchful gaze. some running on four legs, some rolling on wheels, all free, all alive. And if you listen closely, you might just hear the whisper of wheels against the pavement. Because legends never die. Life is full of unexpected challenges. Sometimes we are pushed down so hard that it feels impossible to rise again. But Buster's story teaches us a truth that many fail to see. Strength isn't just about standing tall. It's about finding a way to move forward, no matter what. Buster's life was never easy, but in the end, he was not just a survivor. He was a legend. From a discarded, broken soul to a hero who saved lives, Buster changed the world, not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in second chances. His courage inspired an entire town, gave hope to thousands of abandoned dogs, and built a legacy that continues even after his final breath. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Epictetus. If Buster could find a way to run again, then so can we. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Veil Marks. Every action you take helps us reach more people and spread messages of hope, love, and resilience. And now, I ask you, have you ever faced a moment in life where you felt like giving up? What kept you going? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's remind each other that no battle is fought alone. Thank you for watching, and as always, remember, true strength is never about how you fall, but how you rise.